The former Chief Inspector of Prisons says that this has been caused, at least in part, by the confusion created by Labour's botched early release scheme. Does he now concede that there is a link between the doubling of prisoners accidentally released in the last year and the introduction of their SDS 40? Or is it just an extremely unlucky coincidence? Don't take us for fools. And Mr. Speaker, when will he finally come clean? He won't provide details in parliamentary questions. He won't answer even when he is here for Prime Minister's questions. He won't respond to letters. Well, perhaps that's because they weren't addressed to the Deputy Prime Minister. He's now been dragged here, kicking and screaming, to admit that one prisoner has been on the run from this Labour government for 14 months, and 91 have been accidentally released over the last 7 months. But the Justice Secretary is so clueless, he's literally lost track of how many prisoners he's lost. He says today a prisoner may have been accidentally released last Monday. Well, has he looked? He's either in his cell or he's not. What a complete and utter farce he's presiding over. As we all suspected, the crisis on his government's watch is even bigger than he dared admit. That's why he wouldn't say anything last week. Prisoners are being accidentally released nearly every other day and putting our constituents, his constituents, at risk. At this rate, he's on track for 156 prisoners to be accidentally released this year, which would be a record were it not for the doubling his government managed to achieve last year under their watch. And in his statement today, he poses more questions than he manages to answer. How many crimes were committed by those prisoners whilst they were on the run? Why can't he tell us who these 91 prisoners are? Who is the foreign criminal? And who is this mystery fourth offender he may have lost? How can he possibly be found if the public don't have his face? They don't have his name, like they did for Sharif and Kabatu. The public deserve to know the truth. And this situation could not be any more serious. There's been a 9-fold increase in the number of violent offenders accidentally released in the last year. A 9-fold increase. The criminal justice system, under his watch, has been made to look a total mockery. The public are being put at risk. In his own words, Mr. Speaker, it's time for him to get a grip or go.
Justice Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this is a crisis that we inherited in our prison system. And it's worthy of sober reflection because he knows, Mr. Speaker, that when they were in government, there were 17 prisoners released in error every month. He knows that. He knows too because the former Conservative Justice Secretary said on the issue last Friday, we essentially run our prisons regime very hot. We are very close to capacity. We have seen a big increase in the prison population over the last 20 years, and resources have not necessarily matched that. That is the first problem. And another former Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, said part of the issue is we can't hold on to prison officers without that expertise. Errors creep in. And he himself also challenged their record in office. So he knows that this is a cross-party issue that, of course, we have to grip. Now, I said that I put in place those checks, and I stand by the checks that I put in. I also said in my statement, that the cases that we are uncovering, many of them occurred before those checks were in place, and another case involved an error that was in the court system, and that's why this new query process is very important indeed. And it is the case that we had to introduce SDS 40, and he knows why that's the case, because his government, just in the last few months in office, made 3 different changes to their early release scheme. So worried were they about prison capacity, a prison capacity issue that we inherited. He knows 500 extra places in the prison system is all that they built in 14 years in office, 14 years, and we've pledged 14,000 by 2031. He also knows, like night follows day, if you cut officers by almost 50%, is what they did in office, you cut those officers, and then you recruit new officers, as we've attempted to do, these are doing. But in those circumstances, mistakes will be made. I've asked Dame Lynn Owens to look at this, really, really important. I've put in place the digital team because he knows also that this is a system based on human beings, therefore you get error. Only technology will fix this issue over time, and I've now put in place this double check between the court and the prison system.
Father of the House, Edward Lee.
I serve on the Council of Europe, and it's a perfectly worthwhile assembly, and the convention framed, shortly after the Second World War was designed to counter Nazism, frankly. It wasn't designed to protect illegal migrants into a country. Now, we all know that this crisis is sapping belief in government. Why doesn't the very reasonable Justice Secretary work with the even more reasonable Shadow Justice Secretary and come before the House and say that we will get a temporary derogation from the Refugee Convention, the Convention of Human Rights, and that we will detain and deport anybody who enters this country illegally and will solve the crisis?
No, sir.
Well, I know that the Right Honourable Gentleman is hugely experienced. He will know that it's important that we don't do anything, for example, that might undermine the Good Friday Agreement, where the ECHR is fundamental and important. He rightly mentions the Refugee Convention. That sits with the United Nations. I will be going to Strasbourg shortly, where I'll be taking up many of these issues.
Mr. Speaker, it's been reported in the media that we have prison officers working in our prisons that can barely speak a word of English. In fact, they're using flashcards to instruct prisoners to go back to the cell. Now, you don't have to be a mastermind to realise that this is a recipe for disaster. So could the Justice Secretary please tell me if this is true or not?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I visit prisons regularly in this job, and I pay tribute to the incredible work that prison officers do day in, day out, including prison officers who come from other countries who do sterling work making sure that our prisons are safe in appalling circumstances. And so I thank them for their work, and I reject the premise of the question.
Mr. Speaker, recent events and today's court ruling bring to the surface again the anxiety of our Epping community. My thoughts, Mr. Speaker, remain with the victims, including the 14-year-old Epping schoolgirl. Appallingly, they and their families heard about this wrongful prisoner release from media instead of the government. It is frankly astonishing the government are only using their levers of power in the courts to overturn this case brought by the council, but are not using their powers to address the issues in the front line. The illegal immigration crisis, mistaken release of convicted prisoners, and serious management and safeguarding issues associated with the Bell Hotel, which needs to close urgently. When will the government get a grip, realise that they are not political commentators, but they are players on the pitch, and use their powers to tackle these issues once and for all?
Well, I recognise the sensitivity of this issue in his constituency. And I do recognise that many will have looked closely at that decision in the courts today. He knows that under the last government, £9 million a day being spent on housing people in hotels. He knows that the government is committed to a new programme, and we're looking, for example, at military bases to see where we can house. But he also knows that we have increased the amount of foreign nationals leaving this country and returning to the countries that they are from.
Last week, the National Police Chiefs Council said that there was no doubt that the government's early release scheme was going to lead to an increase in crime. It followed the news. A man who'd been released from prison early has been charged with murder. So it's a simple question. Will the Justice Secretary rule out any more early release schemes for prisoners?
Secretary of State.
Can I just remind the right honourable gentleman that just before the general election in July, his government had 3 different versions of their early release scheme, and we inherited a situation, and he knows this, where prison capacity was completely unsustainable, and successive Justice Secretary under his previous government have said that in the last week. We brought forward our early release scheme. It was important to do that, to put capacity into the system, but it's the sentencing bill that will begin to deal with this issue in a comprehensive way.
Robert Jenrick.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if you strip all that waffle back, he didn't deny it, did he? And that's interesting, because there's been another accidental release by the Ministry of Justice. And this time, it's an email sent in error by his officials to me. It shows his department are looking to accommodate criminals in the community instead of in prison. As you'd expect from him, they say their plans are, and I quote, a finger-in-the-air approach. They say they're considering spending up to 100 grand a year per person to live outside of prison. That's more than the cost of a prison cell. Can the Justice Secretary really say, with a straight face, that his latest scheme is a good use of taxpayers' money?
The right honourable gentleman knows that that email that was sent in error referred to women. And he knows that when you're talking about women, offenders, understandably, the system must consider the fact that many of them are mothers. Many of them have been the victims of men who have groomed them, who have pimped them, who have abused them. And that's why, understandably, public policy makers do look at alternative ways to deal with women in the community. None of us in this House should make any apologies for that.
Rupert Love.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Secretary of State today agree to publish clear, honest and regular statistics on the number of illegal migrants convicted of sexual offences, murder or indeed any other crime? A yes or no answer will do well.
Secretary of State.
Well, we do publish data release statistics in the usual way. After they've been properly analysed, we've got to make sure that all facts are verified, and we've done that in the same way that the last government did.
2 days before Khadur Sharif was released, the Justice Secretary said he had introduced the strictest checks ever seen in our prison system to stop similar unacceptable errors in future. Were they not implemented, or are they not strict enough?
Secretary of State.
I say to the honourable gentleman, were you not listening? I discussed the cases just a few moments ago. I discussed that those cases emanated prior to those checks, so many of them, and that those cases also, one of the errors started in the court system. It's also the case, and I've been crystal clear about that with the House, in a paper-based system where the most junior people often in our OMUs are dealing with this. You cannot eradicate all human error. And any Secretary of State that stood up this dispatch box and said that would be telling a mistruth.
Shadow Secretary of State Robert Jenrick.
Mr. Speaker, Fawad Awale is an extremist and double murderer who later took a prison officer hostage and demanded the release of the radical cleric Abu Qatada. He is the definition of evil. And yet, the Justice Secretary's department is now set to pay him compensation, as his ECHR rights have apparently been infringed, because he couldn't associate with monsters like those who killed Lee Rigby. Will the Justice Secretary ensure that not a single penny of taxpayers' money is handed over to this man? And if he won't, and he puts our membership of the ECHR above the interests of the British people, will he put his money where his mouth is and pay any so-called compensation himself?
So state.
I know that the Right Honourable Gentleman is always keen to get headlines, but he knows that the consequences of judgments and what then impacts on government and any payments made have been an issue for successive governments for the entire time that he and I have been on the planet. He knows that we're committed to the ECHR, offering asylum to those who genuinely are fleeing torture and execution, but he knows too that on the issues that I referred to earlier, Article 8 particularly, and what we can do domestically, and how we can work with European colleagues, we are seeking to do that. So this is not the time to start revising decisions that have effectively been made by our courts.
Is the Justice Secretary aware of any crimes committed by wrongly released prisoners whilst at large?
Well, as I've just said, under the last government, William Fernandez went on to commit an horrific crime. They never came to the dispatch box. By definition, if we got to a situation, and we did in 2024, where 17 releases in error were happening, of course it's possible that people can go on to commit crimes. That's why I'm hugely grateful, I know it's police resource, for the efforts of our police to rearrest these individuals, and some of them, as we saw last week, hand themselves back in when they realise that it has been committed in error. Our job is to minimise risk, but in a paper-based system we can never eradicate risk in time.
Timothy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Justice Secretary said one of the prisoners accidentally released and still at large is a foreign national offender, and I know after PMQs last week he will be very well briefed this week. So can he say whether the prisoner was inside for aggravated burglary, drug offences or failing to surrender to the police? And can he also say how this foreign national offender entered the country and whether he was an asylum seeker?
So stay.
Well, I've made available as much detail as I can, given that normally this information is released in July. Case 2 was in prison for a Class B drug offence, and my understanding is, to the best of my knowledge, that that was the F&O prisoner, and I'm telling the honourable gentleman that, but I will have it double-checked because this information was made available to me very recently, and I will write to him if I make an error.
Brother Shelbrook.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, in my constituency I have two prisons, one at Wetherby, one at Wealdstone. I have two on the outside, one at Askham Grange, one at Full Sutton. And they've heard the Secretary of State say that he has put in place some of the strongest measures ever there. The only question that my constituents want to answer to, Mr Speaker, is when will they be able to say that they don't fear people being dangerous criminals being released onto the streets and terrorising their communities?
So stay.
Well, I recognise the anxiety that this will have caused, and in a way this has been a revelation to the public that people are released in error from our system. And I'd want to emphasise that the vast majority of people are released in the correct manner, 57,000 released every year, but under successive governments for all of my lifetime, there have been releases in error. We want to bring that down to historic levels because it has been going up since 2021, but in a paper-based system, implemented often by junior staff. I cannot stand here and say we will eradicate it, but we will reduce it over the course of this Parliament.
Luca.